Hi, my name is Cassie Smith, and welcome to today's webcast. Today's webcast is an introduction to Solution Dynamics Energy Cost Management Services. Today's educational webcast is loaded with information, and we will be running through a fair amount of business data. The session should run approximately 35 minutes, so we will record it today and then post it for your future reference on demand. We'll also leave enough time at the end of today's webcast for some brief Q&A, so if you have any questions, please feel free to post them at any point during today's session in the box on your screen. Today's presenter will be Calvin Wohlert, co-founder and principal at Solution Dynamics, a nationwide energy cost management company. Calvin has 20 years of experience as an energy project developer and energy engineer and is frequently a public speaker on the topics of business energy cost management, strategic planning, and the financial justification for energy efficiency as a competitive business strategy. During his career, Calvin has worked for hundreds of commercial, federal, and industrial facilities, performing energy audits, in-depth calculations, implementing and verifying energy cost savings projects. So with that, I will pass it over to Calvin.
Thanks, Cassie. And thanks, everybody, for joining. Just to kind of orientate you, I'm going to run through the agenda here. First, we'll start out with an introduction of who Solution Dynamics is, so you know kind of where we're coming from. Then we'll jump into a case study and go through the findings there and what our scope of work was. And finally wrap up with some takeaways and lessons learned. I hope you'll find this interesting, and there will be some time for some question and answers at the end. And hopefully I can keep this on course. Fundamentally, who is Solution Dynamics? Solution Dynamics is a small energy services company. We've got well over 100 years of experience when you put the principles of the company together. We've been in business for over 10 years now. We are an independent service provider, which means we're not there to sell any equipment. However, we do offer turnkey services, so we can not only do initial assessments, but we can also actually install projects and engineer projects for our customers. We have detailed understandings of commercial and industrial processes, and we do a lot of work in central plants and critical environments like data centers or hospitals, things of that nature, where reliability is of the utmost concern. Energy is really all that we do. So, unlike maybe some other organizations that do contracting and use energy as a justification or manufacture equipment, we just focus on energy. We also do LEED certified, things of that nature. We have certified energy managers. Basically, energy is our focus. It's what we do. It's what we do best. We get to do a lot of work in data centers. Even though we're a small company, we can cover a lot of ground. This is an example. This is not the example I'm going to cover, but I just throw it out there that we've done some work for some telecom facilities and data facilities where we have various programs. Some of them are geared towards what we call low-cost, high-value opportunities, which are opportunities which have a really quick payback, as well as more traditional opportunities which may produce more savings, but may involve some capital to obtain that savings, versus the low-cost stuff tends to be simple changes that can be paid for out of the operational budget versus a capital request. So here's some examples here of this work. We went through 29 facilities in all, uncovering about $3.6 million in savings at an average internal rate of return of 38%. And many of those were low cost, with savings of about $600,000 a year with less than a 1-year simple payback. And we did all this on a very tight schedule. We went through the first 12 facilities within 90 days. Geographically, we're headquartered in Kansas City, right smack dab in the middle of the country. We've got representation in other locations, myself included, being out of Denver. But as you can see from this map, we pretty much have gotten to almost every state in the union, as well as into Canada, Brazil, and a little bit in Mexico. So the types of services that we offer, I'll just go through this really quickly. I mentioned the low-cost, high-value stuff and the capital improvements. We do audits. We do audits to identify opportunities, but we also take those opportunities and we stand behind everything that we do. But we can take those opportunities, engineer those opportunities to investment grade with firm costs and firm savings, that both of which can be guaranteed. We also do implementation then, where we will actually manage that implementation for our customers if they desire. That being said, we can do things a la carte just to fit needs. We also do some supply side services, which is how much you're paying for your utilities instead of energy efficiency work, which is the other side of our business. So they complement each other very well. And actually, this case study will highlight some of that. We do carbon disclosure project filing for customers. We do rebate administration, training and best practices programs, a whole variety of things, including strategic planning and helping. Ultimately, we want to help our customers get to their goals. So enough of the commercial. I'll jump into the case study, which highlights a very large data center that we did some work in here very recently. This is intentionally kept generic, although it's not generic. It's I'm trying to protect the identity of the particular customer at their request. But this facility is certainly in the top 10 largest facilities. They have a traditional hot aisle, cold aisle design, as well as a portion of the facility uses containerized servers. They have about a 25 megawatt connected load. So yeah, it's a big facility. They have 2 different chilled water systems that are more than 4,000 tons apiece with full water side economizers. They reported a PUE of between 1.3 and 1.4, depending upon the time of the year and what was going on weather-wise. The facility was commissioned less than 5 years ago, so it's actually a fairly new facility. And because it's so large, they were able to negotiate a custom rate, which was very aggressive in terms of the dollars per kilowatt hour. They were quite below what most people would pay in that particular area. That being said, there's still a lot of opportunity, even though the energy costs are so low. And importantly, too, is that this party is third-party managed. The facility was built with the latest and greatest equipment. There was very, very little money spared in the construction. They bought all variable speed chillers, variable speed pumps, lots of redundancy. And this facility was intended to be very efficient because the company has a drive to be very sustainable with their data centers. So ultimately, our scope of work was to come in and evaluate the facility in terms of what data points that they have available, what's being trended, and what if the data points aren't available, what additional data points should they add in terms of meter points, and what should they be doing with these data points. That was the initial scope of work, and so it was taking the data points, turning them into KPIs, setting parameters around those so that the facility can be managed well. And also, they wanted us to look at their PUE, how they were measuring that, and make suggestions. And was there a way to take out these weather effects to do a regression analysis so that we could see how the PUE was doing without weather factors. And while you're there, let us know if you see any other efficiency opportunities. So that was kind of an add-on that was added at the end. So what we found, PUE, for those of you who aren't familiar with that, it's total data center energy consumption or power divided by the IT equipment power. So ideally, the best you can get there is 1, where all the energy consumed by the facility is being used to power the IT equipment. That's a difficult number to get to. That's a theoretical maximum. Like I said, this facility was averaging about 1.35 is what they reported. However, the interesting thing about that is they weren't actually measuring what the PUE was, and the question was asked, well, how are you actually figuring this PUE? And we would get a different answer depending on what day we asked the question. So there was clearly a problem there. And because it was not measured or tracked, there was no way to do a multivariate regression model. And granted, this is a company that cares about PUE, and this is a company this is a very large data center which has electrical costs approaching $1 million a month. The available data points, they had a tremendous wealth of data points available. However, very few were being trended beyond 2 weeks. So they had the information, but they weren't necessarily utilizing it. After we started digging into things, we started to realize that their actual data center efficiency was probably closer to a PUE of 1.5 or 1.55, just because of the methodology that we were finally able to uncover that they were using was woefully inadequate. So that was one of the findings. But as we moved through, we found lots of good opportunity. Like I said, they had a wealth of data points available, and these could be utilized to successfully manage the facility, not only from an energy efficiency standpoint, but also from a maintenance standpoint. And once we started digging into the data that they did have, we found a huge amount of opportunity, both in terms of energy and water consumption savings opportunities. Many of these were very low cost. Because it was built with the latest and greatest equipment, they had the equipment that they needed, and it was efficient equipment. A lot of the opportunities were available just to simply change how the systems were being operated to maximize the benefit that equipment can provide. So the paybacks were very quick. Also, the interesting thing about the facility is I had mentioned that they had negotiated a custom rate, but their custom rate was a flat rate, so it was independent of time of day. And this facility had the ability to manage its load and participate in various demand response programs without sacrificing reliability and without sacrificing integrity of the data center or comfort. So realizing that there's a significant opportunity to be able to manage the load and even get better pricing on their utility costs, because they can not necessarily take load during the peak price time. You know, I said it's a flat price, but let me back up a little bit and explain this. So when they negotiate a flat price for electricity, what actually happens is the provider looks at the expected load profile, and they factor in that electricity for them, the supplier, costs more certain times of the day, certain seasons of the year, than it does during other periods. So they bundle up that whole set of information and give the customer a negotiated flat rate, which includes sometimes I got to buy it expensively, sometimes I can buy it cheaper. So if the facility is actually able to manage their load profile a little better, they can manage when electricity is being consumed, change that load profile, give that adjusted load profile to the electric company who's giving them this special rate, and then they can reprice the deal and actually get them an even better rate. It could be a rate where price varies throughout the day, or it could be a rate that's just been levelized to account for this revised and agreed upon load profile. So getting into what we actually found, I'm going to run through a couple of different charts, and this is not all the data by any stretch, but I'm tend to be focusing on just the chilled water systems here. There's other data points, but keep this from being too extensive, and I'm just going to touch on the chilled water, some of the chilled water data points. So there's a lot of different data points that were available. We looked at what was available, whether it was there or not there, and if it wasn't there, we recommended that it would be there in certain cases. The ultimate goal of data is to take this data and to be able to utilize it for something. Just having streams of data is not beneficial to most facilities, because What you want to be able to do is take that data and distill it down into something that's meaningful in a way that can be quickly communicated versus just reams of numbers. So what we had was a whole variety of data points. Some existed, some didn't. For the most part, this facility had, again, it's fairly new, all the latest and greatest equipment. They have tons of data. There were a few points we recommended that they added. Some of the points were actually already available. They just weren't tied into the system. And again, most of the points weren't being trended long-term, which would really be beneficial. So we made our recommendations there. But the big idea was to take this data and create virtual meters out of them, a virtual meter being a KPI. It's not an actual meter, but it's a calculated meter based on, actual measured points, be them temperature, kilowatt hours, flows, what have you. So we want to take this data and distill it down into KPIs. KPIs are often ratios, such as kW per ton of chilled water. There can be a wide variety of things. KPIs can also be equations that are more than just a simple ratio. They can be a curve fit. So an example of that would be taking your PUE calculation, which is a ratio, but it's a roll-up of all the stuff underneath it. And then that PUE number is going to change over time depending upon, if it's a really hot, humid day out, and there's a lot of load in the data center, it's probably going to be worse than on a day when it's cool out and you're in economizer mode. So being able to take those weather factors in and really dig down to, how efficiently am I operating my system versus how efficiently could I operate my system. Once you factor out those other things is what you do in a multivariable regression. So you create these equations which automatically factor that stuff out. And then, of course, you can set alarms around it and exercise caution when you do set alarms, because you don't want alarms going off all the time and then they just get ignored. We recommend using a top-down approach for KPIs. So in other words, you want to start with your top KPI like PUE, which is your overall goal. And then when you start to have problems or you see drift, then you can start drilling down into lower and lower level KPIs to find out where the problem's coming from, which is causing your top level KPIs to drift. So, when you get huge volumes of data, everybody's talking big data now. These can be huge volumes of data. You want to start at the top and go through sorting through that stuff in a systematic way, and it's usually a top-down approach. When you're setting up KPIs, you want to be able to have a base to compare those against as well. So it's good to not only compare the KPI to what it was last week, last month, but how does your KPI compare to your goal, for example? And then how does it compare to best in class or theoretical maximum? So that's a brief discussion on KPIs. For this particular site, again, getting back to the chilled water system, we're looking at global level as a PUE. If you go down to drill down further, you get down into chiller level, chilled water loop level. Again, there's two different loops here. What does the whole loop look like in terms of kW per ton? What does the chiller look like in terms of kW per ton at each chiller? There's multiple chillers in each loop. There's also some thermal storage at this site. Whole variety of KPIs. I won't go into all of those. An example of like a maintenance-related one and an energy one would be non-condensables in the chiller. If you start getting non-condensables, you can tell that based on the leaving condensed refrigerant liquid temperature versus pressure. You can tell if you have contaminants in your refrigerant loop in your chillers, as an example. So anyway, once we started looking at this data, this is what we started to find, and this is just an example. If you look at the curves here, some of the savings associated with the chillers, what you can see is that I mentioned they had economizer mode. So what we see in this is that we're looking at kW per ton. When they're in economizer mode, it's really, really low. If you look at kW per ton, when they're not in economizer mode, it's actually pretty good as well. Trying to find that on here. So here's the kW per ton when they're not in economizer mode. They're still running good. I mean, they're around 0.4 on average kW per ton, which is indicative of a new variable speed chiller. The issue here, though, is that as we look at the data further, there is a lot of times when they are operating chillers when they don't need to be, when they should be in free cooling mode. So we looked at the number of hours that they were in free cooling mode versus the number of hours when they were operating the chillers, and there's a lot of opportunity to maximize the free cooling. Just by taking advantage of this, there's a little glitch in the logic in the program which caused trouble switching between economizer mode and chiller mode. And by doing a little reprogramming, they were able to utilize or to realize cost savings of approximately $100,000 a year for some programming costs that cost roughly $13,300. In this area, they had really good rebates, so the net cost was actually zero for that. So the payback is instant. Other things that we found from looking at what little data was available is, again, all variable speed drive chillers. However, they weren't operating the chillers at the best load point. So a variable speed drive chiller actually consumes more energy than a fixed speed chiller when it's operating at full load. And the way that the system is being controlled and was programmed was that they would base load one chiller. Once it got nearly fully loaded, they'd base load another chiller, and so on. So they'd stage up their chillers, and so you'd have multiple chillers running at full load, when actually the chiller performance is much better when it's at around 50% to 60% load. If you look at a histogram that we have here, you can see the number of hours spent at certain load ranges on the chillers. And so they're loading these chillers up, which is not their best operating point, and it can be pretty significant. So the savings here, about $142,000 a year in electric savings. Again, it's just programming change. Rebate covered the whole thing, so net cost is zero. The other thing that we found is, this is just an example of the stuff that the data can tell you when you start looking at it, is that they have a very good approach, which means they have a lot of cooling tower capability. So they're able to get rid of the heat well, very well. In fact, their approach is much better than normal design. So they didn't skimp on the cooling tower capacity. So what you see here, though, is this is also related to economizer mode, because they can get very close approach on their cooling tower to the wet bulb temperature here. Approach is the difference between the outdoor wet bulb temperature and the condenser water temperature. You can see that they can get very close, which means there's a lot of opportunity to be using their economizer. The other thing that you see here is that this condenser water temperature doesn't change much. It comes down to about 68 degrees and then levels off there. Well, the reality is that these chillers can go down to 55 degrees by design, and they can actually go lower than that if you program in some routines to follow the surge curve of the chiller. So there's another opportunity that they weren't taking advantage of. Again, this comes back to the kW per ton of the chiller and load, as well as head pressure relief or floating condenser water temperature. So these two curves are from the ratings on the chiller, the York YK chiller. This is the actual data in here. It's a little chunky because we don't have that many data points, but it's enough to see what's going on. They're operating at a 68-degree condenser water temperature, which puts them somewhat in the range. 0.4 kW per ton is what we saw on the other chart. Corresponds with that's an average number between all the chillers, but this one particular chiller, you can see that their kW per ton is somewhat off, and I find that manufacturer's data tends to be off at the low end. But anyway, the opportunity here is to, of course, push their condenser water temperature down and operate more in a load range. In this 50 to 60% load range, you can see that your kW per ton is less than when you're operating closer to 100% load. So there's opportunities on both how you stage the equipment, as well as how they're operating the condenser water temperatures to achieve savings. So just by doing those things, there's about between $125,000 and $150,000 worth of savings, just simple reprogramming, no cost after rebate. And they could, like I mentioned, do some dynamic reset on the actual head pressure lowering for these chillers to even go lower than 55, depending upon how the chiller is loaded at the time. So overall, in terms of the utility cost savings picture, these were just a couple of examples that I pointed out, but we had 9 opportunities in the chilled water system for a combined total of $425,000 worth of savings, all at low cost, no cost after rebate. The air handling systems, which we really didn't talk about, there were 7 opportunities uncovered just by looking at the data that they already had for $285,000 worth of savings. Again, very quick payback on this. There was some actual implementation costs. Some things had to be modified, but less than a 1-year payback after rebate. Again, new facilities, got all modern lighting, but there was the opportunity to add some controls to the lighting, get a little bit of savings there. Thermal storage was an interesting one. They have thermal storage on site as a backup. We were actually able to make some simple modifications to that system. You know, there's some costs associated with it, piping changes. However, this could actually increase their reliability by adding more and allowing them to get more out of the storage that they already bought, just by changing how it's configured and revising the controls. And then by participating in the demand response, you know, that's another $150,000 worth of savings. In addition, you know, all this electricity that gets saved ultimately gets dumped out of the cooling tower. So the savings that are electric savings translate into less load out the cooling tower, and less load out of the cooling tower means less water that's evaporated. So there's also the opportunity to save a significant amount of water with all of it. And this moves their PUE from what is actually around 1.5 to closer to 1.35. Again, the facility's got a highly competitive rate, yet overall, the interactive effects between all these measures, I'll go back one, the interactive effects between all these measures, you would lose about $180,000 worth of savings, because some savings interrelate to some of the other savings. But net, you would still be around $960,000 per year in savings for a total implementation cost of about $825,000, less than a 1-year payback after rebate. So the internal rate of return is higher than 100%. So in terms of takeaways and lessons learned, how energy is purchased can have a large impact on how energy use can be managed in the facility, and vice versa. So how you, if you're buying energy on a time of day rate, then that gives you incentive to do something about how you use energy during the day. Use less during on-peak price times, and vice versa. If you can change how your load profile is, maybe you can negotiate a better rate. So they are interrelated, and it's a significant factor that's often overlooked. Understanding exactly how your PUE is calculated or measured. Ideally, it's measured, but if you do calculate it, make sure that it's being calculated in a way that makes sense, in a way that's accurate. And then, you know, the big takeaway here is by leveraging the tools and resources that you already have, you can achieve significant improvements. And then taking this data, you can actually continuously monitor and commission to make sure that the facility is operating at its peak efficiency. It's one thing to have a lot of data, but if you want to put that data into KPIs and have somebody watch it. And you know, just because the facility is built with the latest and greatest equipment does not mean that there's not opportunity for improvement. And also, just because the facility has a very low electric price or gas price, if you're using gas, does not mean that there's not opportunity. Oftentimes, it's better that it's built with the latest and greatest equipment, because you can leverage that equipment to achieve significant gains for almost no investment. That's what I have for today. That completes today's webcast. I'm going to hand it back over to Cassie for some question and answer.
All right, thanks, Calvin. Thanks for your presentation. And as we mentioned before, we're going to be posting this video on demand because we covered a lot of dense information there in a pretty short period of time. So if you can stay, please feel free to hang on for a couple more minutes. We have a handful of questions here. If you need to drop off, I'd just like to say thank you very much for attending and to encourage you to visit us for some more educational information in the future. So Calvin, there are a couple of questions here, and the first says, the numbers you show in this particular case study are quite significant. Is this similar to what you would find in most facilities, or is this a particularly bad facility?
Oh, well, I wouldn't say it was a particularly bad facility. It's a particularly large facility. But no, actually, it's amazing. We find energy savings in nearly every facility that we go to, and in fact, we're set up as a business to guarantee that we find savings. So if we first we need to know something about the facility, but once we know some basics about the facility, it's really a no-risk endeavor. So if you're worried about whether or not there's savings, there's almost always savings. It's just a matter of how big is the facility and what kind of payback are you needing in order to be able to get something approved.
Okay, great. Our second question says, our facilities tend to be small and this site is obviously very large. Is there a minimum facility size requirement for the type of this type of evaluation to make sense?
Yes, actually, that's a great question. There is. We don't necessarily, when we talk about size, though, size is something that is akin to commercial property in terms of square foot. When you're looking at energy work, we tend to do work in data centers and hospitals and industrial facilities, particularly in industrial facilities. Size makes no difference. It's all about energy use. So we look at energy use, and if the facility spending all in on energy or electricity, gas, water, if it's spending at least $1 million a year, then there's chances are that there's opportunity. If it gets below that, it gets to be more of a challenge for us to be able to cost justify our time to go to the site and do the work that we do. So we're very sensitive to that, and we need to be able to find opportunities in order to get paid. So that is a very important question. But payback comes into that as well. So if somebody's willing to take a longer payback, then we can look at a smaller facility. If somebody wants a really short payback, then the facility has to be larger in terms of utility spend. But right around that $1 million per year number is kind of a typical average. Hopefully that answers the question.
Okay. We have one more question, and that question says, we have many individual air-cooled package units which are not on a chilled water system. Can this type of assessment still work for our situation?
Yeah. You noticed that there was a fair amount of opportunities that were associated with the air handlers themselves. But there are also, depending on where you are and what the load is, Solution Dynamics actually has a patented retrofit for packaged DX refrigerant units that can be considered. There's also tends to be a longer payback though, but that can be financed. But there's some nuances to that. But even aside from that, there's things that can be done on the air handler side. There's things that can be done on the lighting side, and the existing units. There's often things that can be done with those, even if they're not on a chilled water, in terms of making sure the refrigerant charge is right, that if they have air side economizers, that those are working, things of that nature, that the compressors aren't worn out. So yeah, that's a very good question, and it is unfortunately pretty common to have all air-cooled units. I say unfortunate because they're just inherently less efficient than a water-cooled unit is from a physics standpoint.
All right, thanks, Calvin, and I want to thank all of the attendees for coming today. Once again, we'll post this on demand, and thank you very much, Calvin, for your presentation.